With Session Update, I'm Julie Bartkey. As the 2014 legislative session gets underway, lawmakers are expected to revisit several key issues that initially surfaced last year. We highlight 4 of those issues right now, beginning with minimum wage. Debate over how much an increase would benefit employees versus the effects it would have on employers, along with discrepancies about how much to raise the state's minimum wage, resulted in a legislative stalemate. John Brune provides this recap of the minimum wage discussion of 2013.
Minnesota last increased the state minimum wage in 2005. In 2013, bills were passed in both the House and the Senate, but a compromise between the two bodies proved to be elusive, and the session ended without a deal.
The major differences between the House and the Senate was that with respect to minimum wage, the Senate was at a phase-in of $7.75, and the House was at a phase-in of $9.50. In addition, the House had an escalator provision and various other provisions that were not contained in the Senate bill. The minimum wage is part of what is called the Fair Labor Standards Act. That sets a floor, that's the state of the law, and the states are free to go above it. So the federal law with respect to fair labor standards, which is overtime, child labor, and minimum wage, sets a floor. States are free to go above that. 18 states have.
The minimum wage debate is complicated. In some cases, there are exemptions to the minimum wage, as well as different wage levels, depending on criteria such as an employer's yearly earnings.
The federal minimum wage is now $7.25. It applies to covered employees, which generally means employees who are involved in businesses who have gross revenues exceeding $500,000. It's more complex at that, but that's general. The state has 3 minimum wages. For large employers, which are employers who have revenues over $625,000. For small employers, whose wages are less than that, the wage for employees of large employers is $6.15 an hour. The wage for employees of small employers is $5.25 an hour. There's also an additional minimum wage called the training wage or the youth wage for employees under the age of 20. For the first 90 days, they can be paid $4.90 under state law.
Much of the Senate floor debate in 2013 focused on what the economic impact of a minimum wage increase would be, how much it would raise the standard of living for some employees, and how it would affect some employers.
It is time for Minnesota to take action on raising the minimum wage. Minnesota's workforce is highly educated and highly productive. This strong workforce has delivered a high quality of life for Minnesotans. But unfortunately, Minnesota has fallen behind. The last time we increased the minimum wage was in 2005. We joined Wyoming, Arkansas, and Georgia as the only 4 states with minimum rates lower than the federal wage. This bill raises the minimum wage to $7.75 by 2015, which is a modest 50-cent increase over the federal rate.
I was just looking at a Texas A&M study that clearly states, and please forgive me for reading, but I want to make sure that I get this out there. Following the most recent recession, unemployment remains disproportionately high for less educated and inexperienced workers. Our study illustrates that the most prominent employment effect of minimum wage laws is a decline in the hiring of new employees. When we raise the minimum wage above the economic equilibrium, when we raise the minimum wage above those states that neighbor us and that we compete with, we are going to lose these jobs.
The last time minimum wage was increased was in August of 2005, and that was 8 years ago. And just about every year since then, the cost of living has gone up somewhere between 3.5%, but the minimum wage hasn't gone up. And so when you talk about the buying power of people who are working at minimum wage, their buying power hasn't increased at all, yet the cost of living has increased each year since then.
There's an economic argument on each side. Each side argues that the economy will either benefit or suffer from raising the minimum wage. Proponents say the people who make more money will participate more in the economy. They spend locally. They don't have to enroll in social welfare programs because they actually qualify at the minimum wage.
Leading economists indicate that low-wage workers are more likely to spend a small increase in their income more quickly than other workers in the economy because each additional dollar they make goes to pay for basic needs. By putting more money into the pocket of low-wage workers, we are increasing total demand for the goods and services businesses sell.
Those who oppose an increase in minimum wage say that respect to many employers, that will lead to a cut in jobs because they have a fixed budget for labor expenses.
Whenever we consider raising minimum wage, it's actually a government-imposed cost on businesses. By increasing the costs, we keep piling on the expense of business to operate. Some of these businesses will not have the opportunity to raise its prices on the products or services because of the competitive nature of the business market. As a result, the business have no other alternative but to lay people off to absorb this cost.
The House File 92 is pursuant to joint rules is laid on the table in the House. If the conference committee, the current conference committee is by rule taken off the table and conferees are appointed, the next step would be for the conferees to meet. It would not go back through the committee process. Other legislators are free to introduce their own bills, but this bill is, if it's taken off the table, alive and well, and not having to go back through the committee process in either house.
Raising and lowering of taxes usually stirs debate with the state legislature. A tax on certain warehousing operations last year spurred calls for repeal even before the legislation is expected to go into effect. Here is some background on the 2013 warehouse tax debate.
The Minnesota Legislature voted in 2013 to broaden the state sales tax base to include certain warehousing storage operations. As Minnesota transitions to a more service-oriented economy, state lawmakers moved in 2013 to recognize that shift, debating an expanded sales tax base and a reduction in the sales tax rate.
We had a lot of discussion about sales tax expansion this year, and Senator Rest and the Reform Division did a lot of work on trying to broaden the sales tax base while we lowered the rate, really trying to reform and stabilize, make the sales tax more modern, bring it up into the today's economy.
The economic theory behind broadening the base and reducing the rate, remaining revenue neutral, would be to pull in more taxable goods and services into the sales tax base. And when you have more goods and services in that base, you have a more stable sales tax revenue and a less volatile revenue stream.
The Senate Reform Division initially proposed the warehouse tax effective date for July 1st of 2013, keeping it consistent with other sales tax proposals within the committee's division report. But as the proposal moved through conference committee, some changes were made.
There was an acknowledgement that there is complexities involved with administering this tax for the various industries, be it petroleum, general warehousing, and that as an effort to address some of those complexities or help in administering the program, that they would give additional time to address those complexities. And so the tax was delayed until April of 2014.
Although the effective date was pushed to 2014, the proposal stirred immediate debate and produced calls to re-examine the issue in the 2014 session.
The warehousing industry sets their contracts for years out, and so when they look at what's happening in the state, they look to the tax that's happening that's not even going into effect until April of 2014. And so the industry is suggesting to the legislature that this is already a problem because they're trying to get their contracts in place for following years.
Lawmakers did provide various exemptions and limited taxes in some areas within the warehousing service industry. But those operations not exempted say they face a competitive disadvantage.
A 6% sales tax imposed on warehousing services would put Murphy Warehouse Company and others in the state at severe disadvantage with our neighboring competitors in Wisconsin and other states. Our customers would simply go to neighboring states to reap the benefit of lower costs.
This is no exaggeration. Extending the sales tax to warehouse services would really put our company out of business and would cause harm to the Minnesota warehousing industry in a whole.
Industry concerns and the complexity of administration of the warehouse tax have resulted in continued discussions on the tax. News of a budget surplus in December prompted Governor Dayton to express his desire to make adjustments to some of the 2013 taxes.
If this forecast holds, however, I expect to propose the elimination of all 3 business-to-business sales taxes, effective April 1st, 2014, at a cost of $231 million for the rest of the biennium.
The November budget forecast is the first view of the state's coming financial future. The forecast in February updates the fiscal picture, helping the governor and legislators to get a better financial outlook. As more information becomes available, the legislature will decide if these taxes are a viable contribution to the financial well-being of the state.
Again, you are watching debate centering around one of 3 business-to-business taxes, the warehousing tax. It is scheduled to take effect on April 1st. Up next, transportation. The financial resources needed to maintain the state's roads and bridges is always an important one at the Capitol, and funding tends to be a lengthy debate. House and Senate members did compromise last year on a funding package. John continues his reports on several key issues with the 2013 transportation legislation.
Minnesota's transportation system has long been an important part of the state's infrastructure, ensuring a consistent need to service Minnesota's roads, bridges, and transit operations. Numerous options to fund and improve the state transportation system were discussed and debated in 2013.
The final budget bill that was passed by conference was a real compromise between the House and the Senate. The Senate came in with a much larger funding package that raised new revenue in various ways, and the House had slightly more than a lights-on bill. Lights-on meaning, continued funding for existing programs, no new revenues raised. What happened in the end was some immediate funding, general fund cash, to keep the Southwest Light Rail Transit project going. $37 million was appropriated one time in 2014. That was sort of the next phase of the project needed to be funded. And another big piece of the enacted budget was sort of a compromise, was to do some trunk highway bonding. That's bonding against the trunk highway fund, the state highway fund, of $300 million. And that is going to go toward a new program in state construction called Corridors of Commerce, which are projects that are not in the existing state transportation improvement program, that are found by the commissioner to improve commerce in the state of Minnesota.
In a press conference with Governor Dayton announcing Corridors of Commerce projects, Transportation Commissioner Charles Zelli explained the primary focus of the program.
It is essentially there to add capacity in bottlenecks in certain interregional corridors around the state, and also to kind of help freight movements. We know that the prosperity of our state depends on more than just passenger vehicles, but freight is expected to increase as much as 30% over the next 20 years, and we have to develop the capacity to maintain the kind of commerce that I've witnessed firsthand as I've traveled around. I have actually visited plants and manufacturing facilities, and I know that logistics is those businesses' #1 concern.
The list of recently approved projects include 2 in the Twin Cities metro area and 8 across greater Minnesota. Those projects must meet certain criteria to qualify for inclusion in the program.
The projects cannot be in the current state transportation improvement program. They should not be already programmed by the department. They're it's trying to fund those projects that have merit but have not fallen within the parameters, the guidelines that district engineers in the state currently use to fund projects.
State lawmakers discussed many transportation options throughout the 2013 legislative session, but settled on a fairly consistent bill as compared with other years. What, if anything, will happen in 2014 may not be determined until the legislative session concludes in May.
Again, you are watching a recap of the 2013 legislative transportation package. A transportation working group has already asked the legislature to consider a 5% fuel tax to help fund transportation needs. Finally, John delves into the Safe and Supportive Schools Act, also known as the anti-bullying bill. The Senate proposal was widely debated in 2013, but it failed to gain final passage. Next, a closer look at that bill, a recap of the current law, and what some lawmakers say about the legislation.
I bring this bill to you because we've waited so long to really meaningfully address bullying that occurs in our schools across the state. We know from a survey...
The Safe and Supportive Minnesota Schools Act, a name given to state anti-bullying legislation, was debated at the Capitol in 2013, but failed to gain final legislative approval. It is one of a number of proposed bills expected back in 2014. Current Minnesota law sets a basic requirement that all school districts must have an anti-bullying policy. The law does not specifically state what that policy should be or how bullying should be defined.
A lot of people have, I guess, take issue with the current law that it doesn't tell people enough, that the districts don't really know what to do. Even though if they have a policy, they may not know how to respond or consider certain incidents as bullying.
Right now, Madam President, we have what is widely recognized to be the weakest anti-bullying effort in our state statutes, completely lacking in any meaningful direction to folks who are working on this issue at 37 words, and it significantly lacks some important provisions.
The anti-bullying bill that lawmakers debated in 2013 was much more detailed than the current law.
The proposed legislation has elements of training for volunteers, staff, and students, which is not a part of the current law, because the current law just tells you you have a policy. It doesn't tell you, again, the components of that policy. And the proposed law also has items about when to start your investigation and what are some appropriate responses by the school to incidents of bullying and how to stop it from happening again.
Senate committee testimony reflected troubling personal experiences, as well as varying concerns about the proposed legislation.
When I was 7 years old and in second grade, I was the victim of ongoing and repeated bullying at the elementary school I then attended. The bullying was done by two students that were in the same class as me. The bullying that happened to me included physical harm, verbal threats, intimidation, and stealing.
The locker rooms in middle school were hell for me. I was constantly threatened and called faggot by the boys in my grade, and my gym teachers ignored any attempts I made to explain to them why I was uncomfortable changing in a room full of boys who were making my life hell. The bullying got so bad that in middle school I seriously considered taking my life numerous times, and between 7th and 8th grade had a failed suicide attempt.
I agree that we need a new law in place to address the very real problem of student-to-student bullying, but I believe that as it's currently drafted, there are some concerns that make it difficult for an administrator to implement. Bullying can come up in a lot of different forms. Physical abuse can be bullying, verbal abuse can be bullying, ostracism can be bullying. Bullying can come up in a lot of ways, and so I believe it was drafted broadly with the very good intention of not leaving anything out. My concern is that it also sweeps in a lot of behavior that is not necessarily bullying.
Session floor debate included concerns that the bill amounted to an unfunded mandate and arguments that it had too many regulations and directives for school districts.
This amendment says that if we are going to impose this as an unfunded mandate, the schools don't need to comply. So that if the state wants to impose this on the school districts, then we simply should fund it.
I spoke with my superintendents of very large districts, Minnetonka, West Tonka, Orono, Wayzata, Delano, Rockford. We had them all in the same room. All of them said, no, they're already doing this. They already have the resources. They already have their plans in place. They do not need this additional intrusion. Their school boards are supportive of them. They have good programs in place. This is unnecessary legislation.
I want to recognize that many schools are doing great work, and many schools and many students and teachers and parents are trying really, really hard. But oftentimes they feel hampered by a lack of support, a lack of clear direction, a lack of resources, and a lack of knowledge.
Minnesota's current anti-bullying law was adopted in 2005 and amended to include cyberbullying in 2007.
You were just watching 4 key issues that are likely to resurface during the 2014 legislative session. All of John Bruin's pieces can be found online at senate.mn/media. You were just watching a series of key issues likely to come up during the 2014 legislative session, a session that is about to get underway.